And joining me now is the CEO of the US Studies Centre at Sydney University, Geoff Garrett. Geoff, thanks for your time. First, can you put into context the enormity of this win for the United States and also how important it was for the Obama presidency?
Well, Jim, it's almost $1 trillion program, adding more than 30 million Americans to the rolls of regular health insurance. It's a really big deal for Obama. It doesn't secure the Obama presidency, but it was a big necessary step. Obviously, unemployment is still 10%. His Democrats are likely to take a hit in the polls in November in the midterm elections. But without this win today, Democrats, I think, would have thought everything was lost.
So he really had to win this vote, didn't he?
He had to win the vote, and now the spinning begins. So he's going to say biggest healthcare reform in the US since Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. The Republicans are going to say just another big government program that's going to add red ink to a budget that's already bleeding red ink.
The obstacles and risks were huge. So is this health reform bill cut and dried now, or with so much opposition and so slender a majority for who voted for it, are there other obstacles ahead, like legal obstacles or action in the Supreme Court? Could it be overturned?
That's always possible. We have they're plumbing new depths of arcanery in American legislative politics to get this through. There are some concerns about the abortion provisions and other things already. But I actually think the big policy-making obstacles are going to be in the future, because while this bill has a lot of spending in it, it needs to raise $1 trillion in revenue, and the revenue increases are bigger taxes and taxes on healthcare plans. Whether future legislators have the stomach for that remains to be seen.
Which is why the Republicans are so opposed to this bill.
Absolutely. The Congressional Budget Office came out and said that this bill would save $150 billion over 10 years, but that's based on the most heroic of assumptions, the assumptions that the Obama administration put into place. And I think, realistically, it'll probably add something to American debt. And as you know, American debt is going to double from 50% of GDP, public debt, 50% to over 90% of GDP on Obama's watch. That's a very big story, I think, not only for the US, but for the world economy.
So taxes may well go up or be rather nasty for Americans, but what will this reform bill mean for the average American who hasn't been able to afford health insurance, the poor, for instance?
Well, there are really two kinds of average American here, and this is why the politics was so complicated. The average Americans you referred to, the 40-plus million Americans without access to regular health care, for them, obviously, it's an enormous boon. But one of the reasons this was hard to get through was that average Americans who vote and already had health care liked what they already had, and they were worried that the Obama plan might destabilize that. So different kinds of average Americans here, and one political problem is that a lot of the people who receive coverage now tend not to vote in American politics, so they can't thank President Obama for what he's done.
Very quickly, you mentioned the abortionists or the pro-abortionists and those anti-abortionists. How important were they in this deciding that this bill would get up?
Coming down to the wire on this one, we were focusing on 10 or 15 Democrats who were pressured in extraordinary ways, really. Abortion is just a polarizing social issue in the US. A lot of centrist Democrats are more on the pro-life side than the pro-choice side, and they were the ones who really needed cover and were under the microscope today. They got the cover when the president said he'd grant an executive order ensuring no federal support for abortions.
Finally, and very quickly, any messages for Australia's reforms or proposed reforms?
Well, it's interesting on the healthcare side. I think the biggest messages for Australia are, one, the American deficit is likely to continue, and now the US is moving on to things like climate change and financial reform, which could have big effects for Australia and for the world.
Geoff Garrett, thanks for your time.
Pleasure, Jim.